In my Bible, it's page 239. I don't know what it is in yours, but go ahead and turn with me to the book of Joshua. What we're going to do this morning is we're going to start off in a new study, and we'll kind of see a little bit of how that's going to go this morning together. But we're going to be studying the Old Testament book of Joshua. A number of reasons why I want us to study the book of Joshua, and we'll kind of see those as we go through our introductory period this morning. What I want you to do is I want you to read verse 1 with me, Joshua chapter 1, verse 1, and let's set the scenes for the introduction period of the book of Joshua. Now, after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord came to pass that the Lord spake unto Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' minister, saying, and we'll read more about that chapter as we go on. What I want to do is I want to set the scenes of what's taking place in Old Testament Israel, because we are somewhat detached from Old Testament Israel, aren't we? Matter of fact, we've never lived in Old Testament Israel, have we? We've never lived under the Old Testament law, have we? Here's a great question for you. Do you know anyone that's lived under the Old Testament law? The answer is no. Do you know anyone that knows anyone down the pages of history that lived under the Old Testament law? The answer is no, because we are somewhat removed from the time of which the Old Testament was in force. Now let's ask this question as just a kind of reoccurring theme for us in the New Testament. Why are we no longer under the old law? Why are we no longer under the old law? All right, the new law. Well, what put the new law into effect? Christ, that's right. Even Jesus said there had to be the death of the testator for that testament to be in force or in will. And we understand that in a semblance of degree in those that we know in our families who have passed away who have had a will. That will is only in force when? After they die, when they die. So we kind of understand that to a degree, but we're not under the Old Testament law. So when we read in the Old Testament of those feast days of which they participated in, do we participate in those? We don't, do we? Why? Because we're not under the Old Testament law. When we read about the sacrifices that they participated in the Old Testament law, do we do that? We don't, do we? When we read about their worship in the Old Testament law, is that how we get our idea of what worship looks like? The answer is no. Why is that? Because we do not live under the Old Testament law. So that brings us to a big question in our introduction. Why would we study the Old Testament? If we don't live under the law, why would we study about the Old Testament? That's right, it serves as a schoolmaster. The New Testament told us that the Old Testament was a schoolmaster to bring in that new law. But why else would we study the Old Testament? The principles, you're right, the principles are still the same. But I think there's a really big point. There's one that, at least in my mind, personally, stands out above all the other things of why we would study the Old Testament. Do you know what that is? Learn who God is, the heritage of Christ, I agree. Ooh, that's better than mine. That's right, we learn what's in it. We wouldn't have a reason to believe in the New Testament if we didn't know what the Old Testament was and why it was coming along. We learned what sin is. Here's mine. I like Willard's better. But here's mine. We learn who God is. Now, I'm not saying we don't learn who God is in the New Testament, but we see God through a large period of history in a really short amount of books, don't we? It doesn't take long to read the Old Testament, does it? I mean, it takes a little while, but in the course of our lives, how long does it take? Well, that's very small, isn't it? We learn who God is. We learned about the creation of this world and God who made man and woman. And I believe in looking at the book of Genesis, we learn a lot about God and man, don't we? God who created man and wanted the best for man and instructed man and worked with man. And my favorite in the book of Genesis, he walked with man in the midst of the cool of the day. Oh, a loving God. But we see a sinful people, don't we? And over in the Old Testament, that's what we see. We see a loving God and a people who love him for a time, but then get distracted. Have you ever felt distracted in this life? I think we all have. We've dealt with issues where we've done that, and we're going to see that in this book. That's right. And shouldn't we know that as well? Those who knew the old law knew there were better things ahead. Don't we know that there are better things ahead too? What better things do we have to look forward to? Heaven. Where's the Christian's next home? Heaven. Now, think about this for just a minute. I know you don't like to think about this because I don't either, but where's the non-Christian's next home? That makes heaven so much sweeter, doesn't it? But doesn't it make our mission on this earth so much more important? I know that wasn't a proper English sentence, but doesn't it make it so important? The beauty of heaven shows us the problems in a place that's called hell. And we see that in the Old Testament as well. So we study about the Old Testament to see what was taking place and to see what God did as He dealt with His people. And here's what happens as we start the book of Joshua. If we just started reading the Old Testament, here's what we would know. We would know that there's a man named Joshua. And he's now kind of taken over a position of leadership for the man named Moses. And matter of fact, Joshua is called Moses' minister, the end of verse 1. He was the one that was there with Moses. He was the one serving with Moses. He was the one serving Moses. But we ask our question about Moses and what was going on with him and what took place with Moses. And that's what happens as we look back in the book of Joshua. So you need to have a little overview in your mind about who Moses was. Who was Moses? Who was Moses? He was a servant of God, wasn't he? Well, what did Moses do? Well, let's just revisit in our minds. This is really easy to do. I'm not asking you to pick the passages. Don't give me the book, chapter, verse. Just tell me what happened in the life of Moses. He was born, and then what happened to him? He was placed in the river. Why was he placed in the river? That's right. Because Pharaoh said, these people that are named Israel, God's people, they're getting too large. They were in captivity. So think about Moses for just a minute. The beginning and end of Moses is what we're discussing. He came into captivity, and he was leaving this earth as God's people were marching toward the promised land. But throughout the middle of the life of Moses, it's Moses who is serving God and working with God's people. Do you ever think Moses was frustrated? You ever think Moses was frustrated? Oh, maybe all the time. He might be, now you tell me if I'm wrong here, this is just a thought. He might be the most frustrated man in the Old Testament. That's right. That's right. It was constant. So let me draw this comparison to us. This is just helping us in introductory thoughts because we're going to see this in just a moment. What people were constantly bickering? Okay, who's Israel? God's people. Okay, is there a parallel to that today? Is there a parallel to that today? If we bicker, what's going to happen? What's happening? What happened in the life of Moses? God's people bickered, and what ended up happening to them? They wandered around. They did nothing. That's what they did. They weren't wandering to get to the promised land.
You read the Old Testament and you get to the fourth book, Numbers, and there's still just 2 years in there.
That's right. They're just getting started. 40-something years, till generations passed, which I believe makes an interesting parallel to the New Testament church, doesn't it? Maybe the reason we're stalled is because we're wandering. We're wandering. I agree. I agree. And so often, what do we want? Brownie and I were talking about this yesterday. So often, what do we want? Our way. Our way. That's what we want, isn't it? It's okay to admit that. But whose way is best? And this is what Israel had forgotten. God's way. And that is Moses, who served as the leader of Israel, and constantly, time after time, he had to present messages to Israel. It's time to come back to God. Maybe we need a message that says it's time to come back to God. So we have Moses, who has now died as we enter the book. And it is Joshua, who's the son of Nun, who was the minister to Moses. And God is getting ready to speak to him because God's people have something they've got to do. And it has to do with that promised land. God had promised them a land to dwell. What was that land supposed to look like? Flowing with milk and honey. Now that's not a huge illustration to us, is it? Because when we look at milk and honey, what do? Well, when we look at milk, what do? We're either opening the fridge door or we're closing the fridge door. That illustration is kind of lost on us. When we're looking at honey, what do? We're either popping the top, someone did it, or we're standing at that shelf with all the honey trying to pick out the bottle that we like best. That's what we see with milk and honey. But what's the illustration drawn of milk and honey? A land where there's plenty. A land where all the necessities. Okay. You're right. Listen, you're right. We live in a beautiful area. That's the idea, where all the necessities of life are met, where beauty and grandeur is designed, which is a good illustration to us because how many of us this morning are in need? Boy, we live in a land flowing with milk and honey. But we shut the door on the milk and we close the lid on the honey and we don't think about it. So these people were on their way to that, and that's kind of how we're starting. They're going to that promised land, but think about this. Moses dies. Why did Moses not enter the promised land? Now, let me ask you this. Is God serious? I know Abraham was called the friend of God. I know that. But Moses more often is called the servant, the minister of God. And yet he was told no. He was told no. He had led them out of Egypt faithfully. That's right. Proves the point, doesn't it? Which should help us is something, it's just something we need to know. God's not going to love you just because of who you say you are. God's not going to do you a favor that He's not willing to do anyone else. What favor has God done man? He died. Now listen, I know there's a lot to be said about you and I. I told Kelly the other day, and we were talking about something, and I'm not going to mention the country we were talking about, and I don't even know how, thinking about it now, we got on this discussion, but I said, we could have easily been born there. And look at how our lives would have been different. Here's a big question for me and for you. Do we love the Lord because we live in the land of plenty? I don't know. You have to determine that. But we could have easily been born somewhere where struggles are an every minute reality. But we're born into a land of milk and honey. And Moses was trying to get these people to that land. And he was frustrated. And maybe in his frustration, maybe in a lapse of judgment, maybe in a number of things, he chose to disobey God. Here's a big question. Have you ever disobeyed God? That makes the New Testament so much sweeter, doesn't it? Because if you and I disobey God, what do we have? We have 1 John 1:9. We have the blood of Jesus Christ that continually cleanseth us from how much unrighteousness? Verse 7 and verse 10? All. Look at the beauty of the New Testament. We see a great picture as we look at the Old Testament. And this is the Moses that Joshua is now trying to stand in the place of, and God is beginning an address to Joshua inside of verse 2. Now, what I want you to do is, let's go through some historical things in the fact about the book for just a minute. When you think about the author and the time of this book that was written, who wrote the book of Joshua? Joshua? Any takers on Moses? Moses is dead. All right, is the writer ever mentioned in the book of Joshua? Let me help you. You don't have time to read the book real quick. It's most likely Joshua. All the things that take place in this book, some of the language seems very personal. Most likely it was Joshua. Matter of fact, many scholars almost unanimously agree, and that's very hard to find when Bible scholars agree, that Joshua wrote this book.
His name means Jehovah Saves.
That's right. And that's the whole theme of this book. God provides, God saves, and we're going to see that as we go through. So we have this individual idea of this taking place. We have a book that was written by a man named Joshua. We'll see some of the timelines that take place as we go through the book. What's the purpose of the book? What's the purpose of the book of Joshua? Think about that. What's the purpose of the book of Joshua? You've studied Joshua. You've read it before. What's the purpose of it?
Conquest and possession.
I agree, but I think there's a deeper purpose, isn't there? That's right. And I say it this way, God provides. God provides. Name me an occasion where God did not provide for his people. Name me an occasion where God did not provide for his people. But now in this much bigger way, they've been wandering, they've been in captivity, and now the promised land is right in front of them. But what do they have to do? They must obey the commandments of God. God's going to tell them about driving people out of this land. The land is yours. I've already given it to you, he tells them. But you've got to drive them out of this land. And here's a big question. Do they follow God in that? They don't. They drive some of them out of the land. They drive most of them out of the land, but they don't follow God's commandment. So Ray has a good thing about this book. It's a continuation of God's story. So we see the book. Let's give a quick outline of the book that will help us go through as we study. Here's Joshua chapter 1. Joshua chapter 1 is Joshua is appointed. That's a big deal. We're going to spend our time in the last part of our segment this morning talking about Joshua and this message that God is giving Joshua. Chapter 2, there are some spies that are going to be sent into the land of Jericho. Now, there is a difference in their report of the 10 spies in Numbers chapter 13, and we'll see that as we go. There are going to be some New Testament lessons from Hebrews chapter 11 and James 2:25 from this very particular chapter. Joshua chapter 3 and Joshua chapter 4 is about the crossing of the Jordan. They're entering. They're on their way. So what do we see? There's this kind of sub-theme in the book of Joshua, marching toward the promised land. Marching toward the promised land. Chapter 5, there's going to be some events at Gilgal that take place. There are going to be some effects that take over with Israel and on the Canaanites, and some circumstances that happen in the latter part of the book. And by the way, manna is going to cease in Joshua chapter 5. Joshua chapter 6, the people of God make it to Jericho. Joshua chapter 7, the people make it to Ai, and there is a problem at Ai. We'll see that as we get there. Joshua chapter 8, there's going to be mountains. There's 2 mountains in Joshua chapter 8, not what you're thinking. There's mountains of blessings and mountains of cursings, and we'll see what took place in that chapter. Joshua chapter 9, there's going to be a covenant with Gibeon. Joshua chapter 10, there's going to be a battle, and it's going to be all the day long. This is where we start picking up in groups of chapters now. Joshua 11 and 12, there's going to be a battle with Jabin and other kings. Joshua chapter 13 through 19, there's going to be the land divided among the tribes of Israel. Joshua chapter 20, which will be a real interesting chapter for us, there's going to be cities of refuge, and we'll have a great interesting parallel to that when we get to that chapter. Chapter 21 and 22, the tribe of Levi is provided for, and admonitions to the tribes of the east of the Jordan will be given. And in Joshua chapter 23 and Joshua chapter 24, Joshua will give his farewell address because this book ends much like it begins. It's the story of life. What happens in life? We are born, and then we die. That's the book of Joshua. If you look at it in the life of Joshua, Joshua has been born, and he's been among God's people. His mentor, his leader, his I would suggest to you, his friend, dies, and then one day, so does he. And that's the book of Joshua as we go through in our study. So start with me in Joshua 1, and let's pick up in verse 2, and let's see what God begins to say. And we will read verse 2, 3, and 4, and then make some comments together. Joshua 1, 2 through 4. Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise and go over this Jordan, thou and all this people, unto the land which I do give them, even to the children of Israel. Every place that the sole of your foot shall tread upon, that have I given unto you, as I said unto Moses. From the wilderness, from this Lebanon, even to the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites, and unto the great sea, toward the going down of the sun, shall be your coast. God has promised these people who have never had a land, the promised land. What I want to focus on as the book enters is number one, God tells Joshua, get up, get up, get up. Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan. You know, there are periods of time in our lives where we have gotten down. Has that ever happened to you? You have gotten down. We have all experienced times, such as Joshua chapter 1, verse 1, where a very close person in our lives dies. No one likes that. This may be in a more magnified sense because the leader of all of God's people has died. Everyone knew him. He was a great example to them. He was most likely a great friend to them. I look at Moses as not a man who led the people, but a man of the people. I think that's two different things. And now he's died, and Joshua, probably the closest person to him, has got to stand up. So let me ask you this. This is our first lesson we learned in the book of Joshua. How do you stand up when you're down? How do you stand up when you're down? Well, he's going to tell Joshua how to do that. Do you know what it is? What is God telling Joshua in verses 3 through 5? You're right, but you're close. He says, lead the people to Jordan. That's close. What's he remind him of? Look inside of verse 3. As I said unto Moses. Do you know how you stand up when you're down? You look to the commandments of God, because here's something that's true. It's God. His commandments have never failed. His words have never returned void. His promises have never been broken. And he tells Joshua, it's time to get up now. It's time to go over that river Jordan. He said, you're going to this land, even the land that I told unto Moses. This is the plan. This brings us back to that promise that Abraham was given. What promise was Abraham given? I will make thy seed, I will make of thee a great nation. This is the continuation of all of those things. God's promises never fail. Here's something that could have been true. I don't know if it was, but I imagine that Moses and Joshua had some big long-term plans. What do you know about those big long-term plans now, Joshua? Moses isn't here anymore. That's got to be disheartening. But he says it's time to look to the promises that I've given you. So Moses is told, or Joshua is told, number one, you trust in me. Joshua is told, number two, a reiteration of one of those promises. It's in verse 3. Every place that the sole of your foot touches, which will tread upon, has been given to you. Here's the beautiful thing, and you and I can make a great parallel about this. The people of Israel were told, here's your land, go get it. The people of the church have been told, here's your home, go get it. Now, we're not trying to conquer land in this life, are we? We're not setting up an earthly kingdom. They were setting up an earthly kingdom with a land that God had promised them. We're looking to be a part of an eternal kingdom that's been set up by God. And here's what God tells us, go get it. What does that mean? Is there anything that you must do to be in heaven? Oh, so the concept, we talked about this as we started, the concepts of the Old Testament don't change. They're in the New Testament. We must obey God. Now, just like Israel, do we ever fail? The answer is yes, collectively and individually. Just like Israel, do we ever want it our way? The answer is yes, collectively and individually. And that's what we're fighting against. We're not fighting against God. We're not fighting against the church, because the church is going to be in heaven, okay? There's no denying that. That's where the church is going to be. The question is, will we die off in the wandering? Remember, that's what happened to these people that we're just talking about in the previous. They're not here because they put their faith, they put their trust in their own lives, and they died off in the wandering. So he says, you're going to go this. Everything you're going to go, everything your foot touches, where you are going to go, this is the land I have given you. He reiterates this promise to him. And then he tells them how this is going to be. And I love how it ends. From the going down of the sun, this is going to be your coast. He says, I've already done it. I've already prepared it. I've already laid it before you. The territory that God has given, it belongs to you. And here's something we need to know as Christians. The territory of heaven, it belongs to you.
Jonathan, the people had to develop a confidence in this new leader.
That's right.
That's essentially what they had to prepare themselves for. They didn't follow Moses.
Moses.
They had to develop confidence in the new leader. Of course, God's going to help them.
That's right.
If they follow what he tells them to do, the confidence is important.
That's right. Oh, yeah, definitely. Definitely. What would you do if you were Joshua? Now remember, Moses is gone. I imagine Joshua quite often went to Moses and says, what do I do? What do you do if you're Joshua?
Can you imagine how overwhelming he must have felt when you're told you're going to be the leader of over 2 million people? You know, you're here and you can't even see the end.
That's right. You can't even address all these people.
I find that so hard to contemplate.
And think about this too. How many times did Israel turn on Moses? You think Joshua knew that? And God says, get up, Joshua.
Deuteronomy 34 says that he was full of wisdom because Moses laid his hand.
That's right. Here may be a great point that we can learn. This was not something I had written down to discuss, but I think we should. We should be willing to help the future generations of the church. Now, I believe in Deuteronomy there that laying on of hands was not just an instruction. I believe there was something more going on there than you and I can be involved in. Moses definitely took him by the way and instructed him. Don't you agree? Can't we do that? Can't we? If we were all gone right now, would the future generation of the church survive? Now, that's a question we're going to have to answer. So what we've got to do as we introduce this book is we need to stand, and this is going to be a bit odd for us to do, in the shoes of Moses before Joshua chapter 1, verse 1. And what did he do for Joshua? He taught him in the ways of wisdom. He instructed him in the ways to lead. What a great way that would be. What if you and I, as members of the church, taught the church that's going to be the future? By the way, let me say something just real quick. Our young people who are Christians, I'm going to ask you something. I just want you to see something that we all need to see. Our young people that are Christians, are they the future of the church? I agree with what you're saying, but think about this. Listen to me. They're also the church. Sometimes I believe we look at our young people and we only say, you're the future, you're not the now. If you are a Christian, are you a part of the church? Just something to think about. Has nothing to do with anything. I'm not saying something's going on, but just think about that. It's not just the future, they're also the now. So what would it look like? What would it take for us to train the future generations in the church? Well, all right, here's 3 questions. I want to ask you 3 questions. They're very specific. I'm going to add a fourth one. I got 4. Might have 5 by the time I get done. Here's number 1. How do we develop our young men who are in elementary school right now, or middle school right now, or high school right now, or college right now? How do we develop them to become elders? How do we do that? That's right, we teach them, but I think it's deeper than teaching, isn't it? You can tell someone all day long how to do something, but you have to show them. Here's some ways we can teach our future generations to become elders, become leaders. We talk about the elders in our homes in a respectable way. We interact with our elders in a respectable way. We live this life in a respectable way, because what does the New Testament tell us about elders? That we should live our lives so that they do it with joy, because if we don't, that's not going to be profitable unto you, which is the church. So how do we teach our future generations? Well, we've got to be who we're supposed to be, and we've got to instruct them and guide them. So how do we teach them, Brownie? All right, by getting them in what's most important. There are a lot of things that are important in this life as we live. School's important, isn't it? Is school, secular education, important? Of the highest degree. So don't hear what I'm saying and say, Jonathan doesn't trust the school system. Not what I'm saying. How many hours does a child go to school every day? About 6. Right now, 4 days a week. It's 24 hours, right? How many hours do they study their Bible? If they come to every service on a regular week, you know how many hours that is? Maybe, just maybe, we see a problem. We see a problem. I know none of our teachers, some of you are our teachers, but you're not in session right now, but here's maybe something we need to start doing in Bible class. Maybe we need Bible homework. Does school give homework? And we make sure that's done, don't we? You're not going to mess up. You're going to get this done. It's for a grade. What about some eternal homework? It's for a grade. So we can teach our young people to be elders by our lives and by really interacting with them in this life. Number 2, how do we teach our young men, middle school, elementary, high school, college, to be deacons? Well, may I give you the simplest answer? Reference answer number 1. Reference answer number 1. Now listen, deacons are not elders. Deacons are not miniature deacons or miniature elders. Deacons are not future elders. One does not have to be a deacon to become an elder. But are there not qualifications for deacons as well? Got to do the same thing we do to elders with deacons. Now, we don't follow the lead of the deacons, we follow the lead of the elders, but the principle remains true. If we want our children to be servants in the Lord's church, we've got to point them in that direction. How do we teach our young men to be preachers? Now, be an example. Let me ask you this. How many of you would want your children to be preachers? I know nobody answers that question, and I know you're not going to answer that question out loud, and I understand why. Then maybe we've got to change our perception on that. Maybe we've got to see something that's really, really important. Here's a great question. Does a preacher have to be full-time? Does one have to be full-time to preach? Mm-mm. 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 You know how we can train our young men to be preachers? We get daddies who say, I'd like to preach at least once this year. We be that example. We're never going to teach the future generations in things that we're not willing to do ourselves. We see that in our country, don't we? When a law is given and we see the lawgivers breaking that law, what does that do to us? Polarizes us away from them, doesn't it? We're never going to teach our future generations to do that. Here's question number 4. I don't have a 5th one, but I have a 4th one. And this is about our young ladies, okay? Now, I don't have a little girl, but I have an idea that you don't want your little girl to grow up. Is that true? As much as I don't want my little boys to grow up. But girls are special in a way that boys aren't. Boys are tough and rough and sometimes mean, and you just whip them all day long. Little girls are sweet and cute, aren't they? Maybe they're a little mean sometimes. I don't know. I'm not insinuating anything. But don't we protect our little girls? We do. That's a good thing. That's a real good thing. Now listen to me. How do we train our young girls to marry a man that's going to be an elder? Isn't that part of the qualifications of an elder? The wife. There's qualifications there for her. How do we train our young ladies to marry someone who's going to be a deacon, a servant of the church? How do we train our young girls to be someone who's going to be married, someone who's going to preach? How do we train our young girls to teach Bible classes? How do we do that? Well, that's what Moses did for Joshua as he looked to the future. And that was long before in Deuteronomy, before he really was going to pass away. That was long before, which tells me something about these people. We've seen God who's told Moses or told Joshua, you got to get up. You got to stand out front. You've got to lead. You've got to build that confidence. And we're going to see more of that as we go through what God is telling him in chapter 1 next Sunday. But here's where we will get some homework. You know what we're going to tell our kids? They got to have homework. Let's have homework as adults. You ready? Here's homework for next class. Let me pull out my sheet so I know what I'm going to say here. Before next week, I'm going to challenge you to do something. Read Joshua chapter 1, just chapter 1, 5 times. 5 times. Start in verse 1, go to the end. Come back another day. Start in verse 1, go to the end. Then when we get here next week, we're going to have a lot to discuss, aren't we? So here's something that's true. Let's be the Moses to our future Joshuas who are coming up. What would happen if Joshua wasn't prepared? Oh my. Might look like some of our cities who have leaders who are unprepared. Might look like some of our worldly nations who have leaders that are unprepared. It might have looked like today, but that doesn't have to happen in the future.
There was no hesitation on Joshua's leadership, whereas Moses.
That's right, Moses hesitated. He didn't have that training, remember? That's right, he was much better prepared. So he steps up and he goes across over Jordan. And we're going to see that next week as we continue what God has said and what God has done. So Joshua chapter 1, 5 times. I'll read it with you too, okay? Joshua chapter 1, 5 times. Thank you so much this morning.